This is the tale of Mormon saints and sinners, from our roots until present day. Saddle up.
Gird your loins, lock your hearts, and pay your tithing, because we're bringing you the story of Mormonism in all its paradisiacal glory.
It's the Sunstone History Podcast.
Well, I've sinned so gravely, brother Brigham, brother Young. I've sinned so gravely, brother Young.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Sunstone Mormon History Podcast. We are doing a video today. That's something new that we've been trying, so thank you if you're watching our faces. We're not just disembodied voices. We have mortal tabernacles in the flesh, so just like Brigham Young predicted we would. Thank you for joining us. I'm so excited to talk about this new book that is a new history book, Women's History in Mormonism. It's about the Women's Exponent. And we've mentioned it on the podcast before. If you've heard us talk about Emmeline Wells, we did it before You're Famous, some of these early writers of this women's magazine. And it's now been around. We're going to talk about the history and what happened to it and where it is today. But I have always really found a connection to my heritage and faith because of the Women's Exponent, because of the materials that women have been writing for a long time, since the 70s. And then, of course, before that, I think that it's an important thing in our culture that still exists today. And so I'm very pleased to have the authors of the history of this incredible publication on here today. Katie and Heather, thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me back on the show.
Yeah, we've had Katie on before to talk about the history of the Relief Society, pretty groundbreaking stuff. And so I talk about my historian crushes, and Katie is one of them. So try not to blush behind the book. Bryan, why don't you introduce the authors and then we'll get into the conversation.
I just want to point out an important fact that there is Exponent II swag out in the world, and some of us in the room are wearing it, some of us aren't, and I think it shows. So much fun. We've known Katie for a while now, and we just got to meet Heather, so it's been very fun. So here's our authors. Katie Ludlow Rich is a writer and independent scholar of Mormon women's history. Her work focuses on centering women's voices and their agentive decisions, even when functioning within a patriarchal tradition. Is there patriarchy in Mormonism?
What?
I think somebody told me there was. Katie has a bachelor's in history and a master's in English, both from a certain school named BYU. Her writing has appeared in Exponent II. That's good. That helped. Dialogue and the Journal of Mormon History and the Salt Lake Tribune. And Heather Sundahl believes in the power of stories. In pursuit of this, she has volunteered with Exponent II for 28 years. As a writer and editor, Heather works to amplify the voices of marginalized folks and has collected the oral histories of Botswana, South African, Native American, and queer Mormon women. She received an MA in English from BYU in 1994 and an MA in Marriage and Family Therapy from UVU in 2023. Heather currently works as a residential treatment center where she helps her teenage clients find narratives that promote growth and healing. I'm very happy to have you both here, and I have to say, I just finished reading the book, and it is so fun. Love modern history.
Thank you so
I
much.
have to say, Bryan doesn't say that about a lot of books, so that's high praise. I'm so excited to talk about it, and I'm noticing, I just got my copy in the mail today. I'm noticing that the cover of the Exponent that I did is right there. There's my artwork.
Yes, you are on the cover, Lindsay, and you are in the index.
I know we're in the index, as we found out because Katie did the index, because readers are doing it for themselves when it comes to publishing. So this is so great. I'm so excited to dig in. Before we get into the book, do you want to give us sort of a brief history of the Exponent and the Exponent II, kind of bridge that gap? That might be a good place to start.
Sure. So the Woman's Exponent, the original one, was a publication, Utah-based periodical from 1872 to 1914. And so Lula Green Richards was the first editor, and she was a niece of Brigham Young. And shortly thereafter, after she got married and started having kids, Emmeline Wells came on and was the editor for the next 40 something years. And this publication was very suffragist. They were part of the national suffrage movement. They wrote about women's rights, along with lots of other types of writing. They would have housekeeping tips and recipes, and reprint talks from church leaders given at events. And so it was a lot of the dailiness of life, faith, and women's rights all in the same publication. Emmeline Wells.
Think about it really quick. Sorry, Katie. Just in researching pioneer histories and Juanita, it's very clear that this gave women, especially rural women that were sort of disconnected from any sort of literary or academic scene, it gave them a connection to that, and it gave them a thing to strive for. Women were proud when they submitted their poems or their stories, and they got featured in the early magazines. And I think it gave a lot of women a sense of pride. And I think that that's one of the most beautiful things about it, is it connected women and let them be poets, let them be rural poets, rural instructors, if you will. So I think,
my great grandmother Burnham lived in what is now the Navajo Reservation. Her husband Roy was a trader, and she was a poet, and she published in the original Women's Exponent and just loved it. Just was.
That's so cool. And you're carrying on the work. I love that. Mm-hmm. Okay, sorry, Katie, I interrupted you. You were saying.
No. So Emmeline Wells became the General Relief Society president, I want to say in 1910. And in her tenure, the Exponent II ends, which was kind of like this semi-official publication with the church. And then the Relief Society magazine begins in 1915. And that continued all the way through 1970. As part of the priesthood correlation movement in 1970, in order to kind of economize, the men stopped the Relief Society magazine. And then there was the Ensign, New Era, and Friend as the three publications from the church. In the meantime, in Boston, there are these group of women who are gathering and starting to do projects. And Heather, if you want to kind of take over a little bit there.
Yeah. So you have this group of women, and Boston is just fertile ground. There's just something, I don't know, something in the air, something in the soil that really gets people thinking, creating, doing. There's sort of this, revolutionary spirit there. And these women started doing projects, and the Relief Society at that point in time was so project oriented. People had to earn their own money. And so they would have these bazaars and all these events and do these things, put on these giant gold and green balls, these dinners and things. And the women, Laurel ended up being the editor of a Boston guidebook called Beginner's Boston in 1966. And it was a Relief Society project. And these women, they did the research and they published it, and it ended up selling like 23,000 copies. And it gave these women this incredible sense of accomplishment. It's sort of validated having ambition, that they could do something, they could take on these projects and really succeed. And so then they decided, all right, what's next for us? So then they did the pink issue, approached Eugene England, and they did the pink issue of Dialogue, the first sort of all women's, just women writing and sharing these things. And then they're like, let's do an institute class here in Boston. And so while they were doing this institute class, Susan Kohler, one of the women, goes to the Harvard Widener Library and comes across this giant bound stack of these women's exponents. Now, and so they discovered these. Now, other people knew that they existed. It's not like they were forgotten and then somehow, unearthed in the library. But for these women, it was a discovery. And it was a really big deal. And they thought, we have these amazing sort of feminist suffragist foremothers who did this, and it created a template for them. And they thought, we should do this. We should do. And they named it Exponent II. They're like, let's start a newspaper. And so the newspaper that started in 1974 is very much the spiritual descendant of this original Women's Exponent. And just like people will still in 2024 tease us and kind of make fun of us, oh, Mormon feminists, isn't that an oxymoron? And I'm like, well, what about a polygamous suffragist? Like, how's that for you? Like we're happy to embody these seeming contradictions and kind of create space at the intersection. And that's where the exciting stuff happens.
I love that. Thank you. That's a good introduction to the history of it, and kind of you use the word spiritual descendant. I think I really like that. I think that's it, it's definitely in the spirit of that. Could you speak to, this isn't in our outline, but could you speak to some of the articles that early Mormon women were writing about that might have surprised someone from a woman in the 1890s or 1900s? Is there any topics you think that kind of embody that paradox that you're talking about?
Articles in the original Woman's Exponent. So for the first 10 years of Exponent II, they would publish excerpts, and some of them would seem so radical about equality of the sexes, of women working and getting an education in a way that for Mormon women in the 1970s who are getting a lot of rhetoric from their church leaders at that time about gender roles, to have women talking so frankly about it. Some of the readers of Exponent II would be surprised that this radical thing that they read, then they notice at the bottom that it was from like 1870, whatever.
Yeah. When I taught freshman English at BYU, when I was getting my master's back in the early 90s, and was trying to sneak feminism in, and this is at the time when, Cecilia Farr was let go, and there was a lot of controversy about being a feminist and an intellectual. And I would pull in stuff from the Women's Exponent and mimeograph it off, because they were too cheap to let us use an actual copier. So it was still that purple stuff that little kids would sniff and try to get high off of. Bryan knows what I'm talking about. So, and I would sneak this stuff in there because it was radical. They said everything that I wanted to say. A woman has every right to get an education, not just a right, but she has an obligation to get an education. And it somehow, and the way they made it sound like is it wasn't radical then.
Mm-hmm.
Like they didn't seem like they were pushing against something. It felt like they were just speaking the obvious. Of course, women should be educated.
Well, and that's how Mormon feminism was for me. It was a discovery, right? Like you had mentioned earlier, it had existed, people knew about it, but when you sort of come upon it, especially if you feel isolated or different in your Mormon ward, it really is a discovery. And so what you're writing about now could be as shocking to some people. And yet that's the beauty of Mormon feminism, is it's pretty discursive. Mormon women are very unique. And so to what I might find shocking, other women might talk about. I remember reading Exponent. I think you guys had done a blog series, this was years ago, about women's maternal health, body issues.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, like, that is something our family didn't talk about. We just didn't talk about it. So I remember reading it and being like, I can't believe they said that. I can't, yet some women, Mormon women, that's not an issue. That's in their households that they grew up in. So how about on the blog or as you were writing this, was there anything that you discovered you're like in the Exponent II stuff, the new stuff, where you're like, I can't believe that they wrote about that. That's pretty bold.
Yeah, absolutely. Or at least maybe the way that they wrote about it. So 1982, there was an issue on sexuality that was groundbreaking for Mormon publications at that time. And the cover is this incredible just picture of Paul and Nancy Dredge's hands just barely touching.
That
in
they
this, like, black and
somehow
white
make
image.
Very almost erotic. It really is. It conveys a lot of heat in just this almost touching.
Yeah, and they're talking in that issue about a wide-ranging issues of sexuality with mismatched sex drives, or sexless marriage, or being a single adult who is trying to live the law of chastity and struggles with wanting to have a sex life. And then like fiction about it, poetry about it, and really intimate poetry too. And then in the next issue, they publish a letter to the editor from Affirmation saying, you really missed the opportunity to talk about homosexuality. And I think like they talked about so much in this 1982 issue, but then we're also willing to publish the criticism of what they missed. And that was surprising to me to see how many times there were things that they published that were criticism of what they did or what they didn't do. And that, I think, gave me permission, and me and Heather, that as we're writing, that we can be more transparent than we maybe otherwise did. Like they set that model throughout the 50 years.
Yeah. And Exponent, it's so interesting to see the pattern where they approach something that makes them a little bit nervous, and they're like, we're going to do this. And they do it. And they're kind of like, oh my gosh, I can't believe we did that. And there's always people, and I don't mean this as a criticism, who come and say, we want more. You should have gone further. You know, it's like, it's this constant stretching, expanding of the margins. And I love that people are hungry to talk about things. In one of the essays in here, somebody talks about getting garments for the first time. She talks about turning in her Victoria's Secret underwear. It's Sylvia Cabus, turning her Victoria's Secret underwear for garments. And as we were including it in there, Katie was like, oh, Heather, we came across something where Carol Sheldon early on in the 70s wanted to talk about garments. And wasn't it Claudia who forbid her? Claudia was like, nope. That there, was this line.
Yeah.
And so there's these lines that we just keep crossing. We draw a line and then we cross it. And then we draw another line and then we cross it.
Yeah, Sylvie's able to talk about garments with such humor and grace. Like her last lines, like, what is it? That I feel naked without them. I am naked without them. Like, that we're able to like be open and have fun with it, while earlier, 2 decades before that essay, it felt impossible to talk openly about those topics. And then now, like even in the last year on social media, there's so much conversation about it. And so it's really fun over 50 years to see how the conversations change and see where the movements and progress is made.
I was surprised at how early they talked about abortion. That really did surprise me.
I mean, they are late for feminist publications, right? Like Ms. Magazine that comes out, starts really about the same time. Gloria Steinem's publication, it was talking from like the beginning, having 50 famous names like sign, even if they hadn't actually had an abortion, signing their name, like I have had an abortion in Ms. Magazine. And so it's not until 1990 that Exponent has a full issue on abortion. And yet to talk about it as openly as they did was groundbreaking for Mormon women.
Was 1990 the first time they ever brought it up, or as a dedicated issue, or did it present itself earlier? Because I was surprised 82 to talk about homosexuality is pretty bold for Utah, at least the Utah culture that I grew up in.
So 1990 was the first time they had an issue dedicated to the topic of abortion. And I would have to like go back and check, but I think there are probably little sprinkles of it in essays or in the Sisters Speak column.
In Judy's column.
In Judy's column, yeah. So Sisters Speak was a place where Judy Dushku led it for like 30 years. And she would pose a question in one issue and they would give answers in the next issue. And her big thing was about speaking from experience. And this is individuals that doesn't have the formal constraints of an essay or an article. It's just people talking to a topic out of their personal experience. And so you do get wide ranging responses there. And so I would not be surprised if there were people talking about aspects of reproductive justice, but not as directly as they do in 1990 and then moving forward.
And abortion is still something in LDS circles that it is not, people aren't really happy when you bring it up. It's not a topic that most people feel comfortable with. I blogged about going to, in 2009, I blogged about my experience earlier of going to an abortion clinic, and got a lot of responses like, I can't believe you're talking about this. Like both in a good sense and in a bad sense. Like, thank you for talking about this. And thank you. Don't talk about this.
Well, and your piece was so brilliant. It was called Baby Killer, right? Isn't that what somebody called you? And that was
Yeah.
like, what was the context of why you were going there?
So in 2004, I was 17 weeks pregnant. And at that point, it's not even called a miscarriage. It's called a fetal demise. And so I lost the baby. And my doctor, I was living in Boston at the Brigham and Women Hospital, which is like the premier women's hospital. And they were like, yeah, we're good at this, but you really need to go to the clinic in Newton because they absolutely have this down to a science. And it will be a less physically traumatic experience and you will heal faster if you go there. And so I show up at an abortion clinic, Mormon mommy with 3 children, and there's a protester out there with a big sign of a fetus yelling at me, calling me a baby killer. And, I went in feeling like this is okay because I didn't do anything wrong, air quotes. And then as I'm, sitting in this waiting room, looking around me, I just was overcome with such a solidarity with these women, thinking none of us want to be here. And that's, that was my bottom line, is that none of us want to be here. This is not something that anybody is happy to choose, but thank God we can choose.
So Heather, you don't know this, but when I had an abortion, an ectopic pregnancy, when I was blogging at Feminist Mormon Housewives, and I didn't know it was an abortion. Long story short, it was an upsetting time. And I think it was Rachel Lawrenson that slipped me your essay. Like I'd never read anything about it before. And it was not just a comfort. I'm going to get emotional about it, but it was kind of a foundational way for me to think about it, to be like, because it was the first time in my life I had a Mormon woman like publicly say, it's complicated, I've gone through something. So yeah, I still remember the power of that and the title, because that's what women internalize.
Yeah, that's how you feel. I mean, it absolutely, you feel like people treat it like it's worse than murder. We say it's second only, but we talk about it.
Yeah.
Like it is absolutely just the worst.
Well, Heather and I were talking earlier this week about how Roe v. Wade was in 1973 and Exponent starts in 1974. So, the publication very much emerges from the women's movement and all of these issues. And these women in Boston are wanting to talk about how feminism intersects with their lives as Mormon women. And all of these protests that are happening in Boston and all of these, there's so many other groups that are meeting together and talking and having small publications. But they wanted a space to be able to talk about it within the context of their lives as Mormon women. And then we go forward to 2007 when Heather writes that blog post with Exponent, right? And then even now after Dobbs. So we have Heather's piece in 50 Years of Exponent II, and we also have a poem from Alexa Broby, who is a new grad from BYU Law School, called After Dobbs. And it's short, and it's just this consideration of what are the consequences for this one individual woman after Dobbs when she has to be married rather than have the choice of an abortion in her circumstance. That it is a topic that is still very relevant to the lives of American women, to Mormon women, and you can kind of see how the conversation changes over time.
So you bring up a good point that the Exponent 2 is created in a time of a combination of women's rights movement really gaining steam, being there in Boston, like you pointed out, a fertile ground for all sorts of movements and ideas. And clearly we see a history interest within the group. They're keeping minutes, they're keeping stuff. They can sense they're in the middle of something important. So then as you fast forward, when does the idea of a formal history of Exponent 2 come around, and how did you two come to this project?
Yeah, so we start with me because I'm like the newcomer. I'm the new kid on the block here, right? So 2021 was a big year for me. It was the year where in January of that year, I came on as an Exponent 2 blogger. I did some guest posts in 2020. It's also the first year that I attended and presented at the Mormon History Association conference. I got to meet both Heather and Lindsay in person at that conference. And I was presenting that argument about Brigham Young not disbanding the Relief Society. But at that conference, I also saw Claudia and Richard Bushman from across the courtyard, and just had this moment of just complete intimidation. Like, I had nothing specific to say, but I was like, oh my gosh, Exponent's founding editor, and I'm an Exponent blogger. And it just felt like such a big deal to be in, breathing the same air, in this outside Park City location, because it was, COVID days, but breathing the same outside air. But I in that moment, I'm just kind of thinking, like, Exponent's 50th anniversary is coming up. And over the next several months, I have lots of conversations with Rachel Hunt Steenblick, a friend of mine who was one of the editors of Mormon Feminism, like what would a book project look like? What are some options? And just kind of talking through what the time commitment would look like. And for me, I have 4 kids. My youngest was 3 at the time when I decided to start this. And I was anticipating that this fall was when she would enter first grade and full-time school, and that I was not anticipating getting a full-time job or starting a new graduate program in those years. And I was like, what do I want to do with this time? And decided that this was a project that was important to me. And it was the book that I wish that I could read. These were stories that I wanted to know. But it was also a project that I couldn't do alone. I was pretty new to trying to do professional history. I was new to the organization, and I didn't have those relationships or those connections. And I really needed a partner. I needed Heather.
Yeah. So the timing for Katie was perfect. The timing for me was a little bit trickier. So let me kind of back up and give you kind of a brief history of my association with Exponent. So I moved to Boston in 1996, and within 24 hours of landing there, I get a call from Sister Dushku, a woman in the ward, who is I think she was like the regular ward newsletter writer was out of town. And then Judy's job was to call the new people who had moved into the ward and interview them. And so Judy starts interviewing me, and like every few seconds, she's like, wait a minute, you've done that. And I'm like, wait a minute, you were just in China. I lived in China. And then she starts talking. I'm like, oh my gosh, you're a feminist. I'm a feminist, and she's like, have you ever heard of Exponent II? I'm like, well, I know the women's Exponent. She's like, oh, it's like that, but it's modern. And so I just immediately became enveloped by these women. I felt so at home. It just was one of the greatest blessings of my life to land in that place and that point in time. And so within a month, I was part of Exponent. I was, going to their like little board retreats, because they're so, like, even though I wasn't on the board, Kate Holbrook had just moved. And so Kate and I met at this board retreat in Rhode Island, kind of walking on the rocks along the ocean. And I'm a collector of stories. I'm the person that, like, we'll be together and I'll be like, Katie, tell that story about that one time you ... And she's like, I don't even remember that story. Like, I just collect everybody's stories. And so I have been collecting these Exponent stories for years. And at a certain point, I thought, I'm going to write this history one day. I'm going to do it. And I even wrote a proposal at one time, and through a series of unfortunate events, like it never landed where it was supposed to land. And I just thought, okay, that was my shot, maybe later. So in 2021, while Katie's doing all of this, I am applying to go back to school, and I start a master's program in marriage and family therapy. And I was 3 weeks into that program when Katie meets me for lunch and says, hey, want to write a book? And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I can hardly even figure out how to log on to my UVU account, because I just felt like a dinosaur and just was just really struggling to get myself back in the groove and believe in myself that I could take these tests and that I could compete with these, fresh young minds and all of that. But I could not say no. I just everything in me, everything in my brain was like, Heather, do not do this. Do not add. I had 3 other jobs at the time too, in addition to being in school. But I was like, hell yeah, I will do it. Like, nobody is writing this story without me. I know where the bodies are buried. I love these women. They are my fairy godmothers. I just, I'm like, I am all in. I am all in.
I call Heather the
So-
giver. Like, we would get together to work on it, and she would like put her hand on my shoulder, and I would suddenly see all the colors and learn the stories and just understand things in a whole new way.
Oh my gosh, you gotta love a good Lois Lowry reference.
Well,
I
the
love
combination of you two is, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just gonna say that the combination of you two is so interesting because you kind of embody the evolution and growth of Exponent, where you have Heather, who was right in the middle of that Boston core, that in a pre-internet world, the creation of it at least was Boston.
Mhm.
But then later, as you get into a digital world, all of a sudden it's like now we can have collaborators anywhere,
Yeah.
and that's where Katie comes in and epitomizes that growth and the digital reimagining of what Exponent 2 looks like, what you talked about, because that's a transition from a non-digital print to a digital world. That's a transition that a lot of groups and organizations just don't make, and they just die. Exponent 2,
And it almost did. It
Yes,
almost did.
by that much, and that was a really interesting part. So yeah, I think the combination of you two as authors was a really good synopsis of kind of what Exponent 2 was and has become.
And we're incredibly fortunate that in 1977, the Exponent staff started sending their papers, so to speak, the correspondence minutes, scrapbook pages, a bunch of documents to BYU Special Collections. And so they have 30 plus boxes of Exponent 2 material there that we're able to go dig through and just find all kinds of gems. And we both, Heather and I both live in Utah County. And so we had, access to make trips there. And had we currently, well, I've never lived in Boston, but had Heather been in Boston, like, that's not where the archive is now. So she got all the experience, the stories, the relationships, and then got to come to the archive.
Yeah.
Well,
it's,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, and I think that when you have Claudia and Laurel with their PhDs in history as part of these foundational women, it was, Claudia's whole thing, if you don't write it down, it didn't happen. And so from the very beginning, people were writing things down. They were documenting things. There was an awareness that because they had discovered this original women's exponent, they understood that there can be this pattern of people coming later and finding your stuff. So they were conscious of that.
That's a good seg into what I was going to ask, which was, how did, as the Exponent to get some steam, they start publishing stuff and then putting them in the BYU archives and then eventually going online. How would you say it has been received by the larger institution and Mormon people in general? Because from my perspective, the Exponent and the Exponent 2 is showcasing some of the brightest writers in Mormonism that are women, that you don't expect from a patriarchal religion. So I think it's, a gem in the crown of Mormonism. But how would you say it's been received? Can you?
Yeah, so we can talk about that on, I think, multiple levels. And I think I'll have Heather take, like, how did women receive it? And then I'll talk a little bit about how men received it and the institution.
So you've got sort of two things with women, the women who read it and the women who didn't read it. Almost anyone who read it finds something in it that speaks to them. Now, they may not wholesale. My 92-year-old mother, who is watching Fox News as we speak right now, she reads the Exponent and she doesn't love every article, but there's always something where she says, oh, that one was the gem, something that really speaks to her. And I think it's been like that from the beginning, that women read it and women were hungry for it. You had the Relief Society magazine, and I don't know much about that, but it existed, and at least it was for women. And then you have this transition where then the ensign comes around, and it's men are deciding what is going in it. Generally speaking, it is run by men. The choices are made by men, and women may or may not find themselves in it. And the ensign in recent years has shifted a little bit, but for decades, every single story had to be faith promoting. It had to end happily. And so if you're the person who is pregnant and then you lose your baby, you pray and fast and whatever, and you lose your baby, you're not going to find yourself in there. And so women found themselves in the exponent, both in these deep, heart-wrenching things, talking about depression, talking about divorce, talking about abortion, talking about children and the choices they make. But they also find themselves in this lighter fare of how do you can cantaloupe? And what do you do when every neighbor gives you a squash and you're just overrun with zucchini? There's so much in there that women find. And one of my favorite little blurbs is early on. Katie, you're going to have to remember for me the far out quote. Tell me what that is.
Yeah. So Susan J. Moss from Oregon wrote, "A newspaper for Mormon feminists? Far out. Maybe there is a place in the church for women like me."
And I just love that. A newspaper for Mormon feminists, far out, which is so anachronistic and groovy. I love it. But then that seriousness of maybe there is a place for me. That, you talk about discovery, Lindsay, that there's this theme of discovery with Exponent, and it goes throughout, where women discover Exponent and they find their voice, they find other people sharing their things, and then the women who dare to write, as they're writing, as they're figuring out what they want to say, they're discovering themselves. And so there is this rich history, but you also have women who very much were, no, this is suspect, this isn't correlated, this is not come down from on high. And you had one of my favorite letters, like when Katie found it and she sent it to me, I sent it to all my friends, and we were just cracking up. This woman writes a letter to, is it Elton Perry?
Yep.
She writes a letter, and Elton Perry is in Salt Lake. So this is a woman who writes a letter to Elton Perry telling her how the Exponent women won't include her, but she doesn't want to be included because they're too radical, but still it's mean of them not to include her. And then he sends it to Richard Bushman, and you're like, what? Like, and then the Exponent women are like, we have to be nicer to everyone. We have to, make sure we include people, so they're being told you're being exclusive, but then they're also being told, don't advertise. You can't use church buildings to do your events, and don't leave the paper in the mother's lounge, in the smelly mother's lounge that we've never walked into. But don't leave that in there. And so my experience is that people who haven't read it think it's scary, or think it's apostate, or think it's something. And when they say that, I'm like, you've never read one. Like, you have never read one if that's what you think. But the women who read it, most of them find something. They find a piece of themselves reflected back.
Yeah. I think that stays true for each new generation of Mormon feminists that kind of rise up and find Exponent too. The men, though, for women, it mattered whether they read it or not, their response. For the men, it didn't really matter whether or not they had read it. The response was different when they were church leaders, especially general authorities. So there are, early on, Claudia Bushman talks about things that she views as her two big mistakes that got the negative attention of general authorities. And so these were both in 1975. So, or at least that's when she hears about them. So the first was, there was an interview in the Boston Globe about the church in Boston. And they interviewed Claudia, and in it, she talks about how her husband, who was the stake president at the time, wanted to call Black members on missions, but was not allowed to. So it's, 1978 is when you have the revelation on the priesthood, and priesthood is extended to Black members, and temple privileges to Black members. but that's not yet. And so Claudia is talking in the Boston Globe about these racial tensions and about how there are a lot of white members who want this change to be made, but we're told it's going to take a revelation, but we want this to happen. And they weren't happy about her doing that. L. Tom Perry, on assignment, you know, being asked as a representative of the 12, he had been the former Boston state president and knew the Boston people. So he is assigned to, you know, call and say, hey, it looks like you're being restive about race and you should not be talking publicly about that. But then the second thing is that the Exponent women were so hopeful and naive of what this reception of their paper would be. And they thought that people would be excited about what they were doing. And so they flooded the church office building with copies. Like the first issue, they printed 5,000 copies. They gathered addresses. Dialogue, Robert Reese, editor at the time, sent the Dialogue mailing list. Like they sent it everywhere they could, and including tons of copies to the church office building with the idea that general authorities would give it to their wives and everyone would be thrilled. And so they ended up being very surprised when the church pushes back pretty hard. So they are told never to send it to the church office building again, because it looks like you're trying to tweak the nose of the brethren. But they are also then cautioned like not to use the church buildings, and that it needs to be very clear that this is not an official publication. And Robert Hales comes out for a state conference. He had also previously been in the Boston state presidency and was now a general authority in Salt Lake. And he comes out and asks to meet with Claudia, and he unofficially, you know, cautions her, tells her Exponent will come to no good, that it should cease, and that she, as the wife of the stake president, needs to step down. And so there are no formal written rules about like what a stake president's wife can and can't do, but there are unwritten rules and there are these expectations, and they are afraid it's going to make it look official if she is the editor. Her husband, however, Richard Bushman, a historian, was on the board of Dialogue at the time as stake president. And while Dialogue was getting pushback from the church, Richard individually was not being told that he needed to resign or step down. And so like there's this wonderful moment in the minutes where as the women are talking about this specific thing that Claudia is getting pushback and while Richard is not, they're like, is it a hang up about women? We wonder. So L. Tom Perry, well, the women, like their approach as they're getting pushback now, multiple, like there's phone calls and there's the visit from Hales. They're like, what do we do? And Claudia is like, I feel like I need to resign. And the women gather and they decide to fast and pray and then meet together and decide, are they going to continue? Is Claudia going to resign? And they decide to write letters to Elder Hales about how valuable and meaningful this project has been to them. He forwards their letters to the Quorum of the 12, who then send L. Tom Perry out to meet with them. And so he flies out at the end of 1975. And this is one of the gems of BYU Special Collections. There were 5 pages of notes from this one meeting of a lot of things that different people said. And it was just amazing because you don't get that kind of access from those more modern meetings with apostles and with general authorities, but from this, like, you know, private archive.
And these women considered themselves peers with him. They were friends with him. You know, they were probably saying, Tom, I mean, president, you know, like they were so familiar with each other.
And he's telling them things like, the prophet speaks for the church and you do not speak for the church. We first, like, let's be clear about that. But then also, you need to be clear on gender. You cannot even be marginal, that there are different roles for a man and a woman, and women need to be at home having an influence on children. And you should not question this. You should not talk about the Equal Rights Amendment when it's at its height. You should not put the church in a position to pit members against each other or in the media. And the general boards of the women's auxiliaries, Relief Society, Young Women, and Primary, are going to be dissolved soon because this is, you know, we're a rapidly globalizing church, and we're going to have regional boards of women as a way to like better help represent the global church. And that if you continue with this, you are going to be marked and you're not going to be eligible for these great callings that are going to come soon. Well, Laurel Thatcher Ulrich reflected, those never happened. Like in 2021, they did start new regional callings for women. Still not in the United States and Canada, though. And that's, 2021 compared to when they're being told this in 1975.
And they were also told that they were going to hurt their husband's church careers. And that was, like a thing. Like, you better, do you not want your husband to be called as bishop because you've chosen to do this? You're going to stop his advancement.
So after these meetings, Claudia does end up resigning in December of 1975. She says, I am not repentant, but I am obedient. And she steps down and decides to put her energies into lots of other really great projects that she did over the coming decades, including eventually the Mormon Women Oral History Project, which is housed at Claremont University, that she founded. And it's an incredible collection archive of interviews of Mormon women. And she's done a lot of great things. But what that did for Exponent was that first, the women had to really question their intentions and their goals and their meaning. Like, they had fasted, they had prayed, they had wrestled with, should we do this, should we not? And had the brethren not pushed back, they probably wouldn't have had to wrestle that hard. It probably would have gone the way of almost every other small feminist publication that comes out of the women's movement, where it lasts 2 or 3 years. And then people say that, well, that was a fun project, and they move on to whatever they do next and they stop publishing. Like, that is what happens to most small handmade, pasted up publications.
Yeah.
Is they just don't last very long.
When I think about this point in time with Exponent, I'm a theater person. I'm a total Broadway nerd. And I just think about that line from Les Mis where Enjolras says, it is the time for us all to decide who we are. That they really had to kind of be so intentional. What do I stand for? What do I want to do? And the women, when all the dust settled, they're like, this matters. This matters to women. Maybe the church doesn't want us or need it, but what if the women of the church need this?
Yeah. So
but I also, go ahead. I at some point, Katie, I have to tell my Carolyn Pearson thing that I'm obsessed with.
I think now is a great moment to tell that.
Okay. So you have Elder Hales in, what is it? Is it November?
The minutes from his visit are September of 75.
Okay,
but he meets with her a little bit before that.
Okay, so the minutes are September of 75. And where he says Exponent should cease, no good is going to come of it, this very critical doom and gloom about it. Well, our lovely little most recent issue on the 50th, where we have this collection of all these voices. This is one of the things that I wish we had before we published the book. So you
the
have
50th issue of the magazine.
The 50th issue of the magazine. Yes, thank you. This is excerpts from the diary of Carolyn Pearson. So you also have to remember, this is the 1970s, when President Kimball was not saying to people, read your scriptures every night. He was saying, write in your journal every night. That is the commandment that we got, was keep a journal. Keep a journal. It was, part of that culture of the 70s with the food storage. And that was the flavor of Mormonism. So journal keeping was like a commandment. So you have Carolyn Pearson, who, bless her, has kept these journals. And she talks about, November 4th, 1975. So same year, same season. This is a month later. And she says that she went to visit Robert Hales, assistant to the Quorum of the 12. Brother Hales is an Easterner, rather unlike you, Utah bred of Mormon. He told me he loved me as much as the law allowed, and that he was determined to get my poem, quote, the cast in the new era and not let Exponent II have it. So he's clearly reading Exponent II and is in competition. And then he says, in fact, I learned that the poem raised questions that made them set up a whole new department under correlation, interpretation of doctrine. He said that after reading Millie's Mother's Red Dress, he's never been the same man. And he said, I want to get some of your poems into the Melchizedek priesthood manuals. The brethren need to be reading those things more than the sisters do.
Her poem and Exponent made him be a changed man.
And he wanted that poem from Exponent in the Melchizedek priesthood manuals. And I'm like,
I
okay.
move to have all exponent articles moved to the Melchizedek priesthood manuals, please.
Seconded.
Thank you.
Amen. Any opposed? So I just love that. I just, that shows that, like, on the one hand, I'm like, you keep acting like it's an exponent is just beneath your notice, but it has to stop. And it's, the writing quality is poor, but published with us. And you can see that they were really threatened by this. And it's so interesting to me. But I believe that when you get a whole slew of women speaking from their authentic self, leaning into their internal authority, speaking their truths, it scares the bejesus out of patriarchy.
It's not a
I love
correlated
the
message.
theme of differing responses from leaders, both local, and that's a fascinating part of the history. One that we sort of touched on a minute ago, when Claudia is speaking up about the temple priesthood ban, which of course immediately is going to raise some eyebrows, but that points to one of the challenges that Exponent 2 has to face throughout its history, is transitioning not just locality, but everything. So going from this Boston core of, I mean, entirely white women at the beginning, to a global church, a digital global church. That's a tough transition also, between not, analog to digital, but parochial, local to global. Talk some about some of the challenges that creates and how you deal with those.
Well, Nancy Dredge is really wonderful at this. She is the editor who steps in after Claudia. And Nancy starts doing these guest edits where different groups of people in different locations. So she has the Chicago women do one, and you have Kathy Stokes, an African-American woman, be part of it. And you have these different regions. And so it doesn't totally address what you're getting at, but it starts this process of having it not just be Boston voices, of having people from different geographic places. And you do get a little bit more diversity, but I mean, we still wrestle with this. I mean, I'm always joking with Katie. Yeah, we still suck at race. Like
Mormonism writ large.
It does.
So.
It's a struggle.
Another theme that I thought was so interesting in the history, as I was talking to you guys over the weekend, I've been rewatching the American Experience documentary on the vote and women fighting for the vote, but watching the internal discussions on differing approaches. And they highlight the story of Alice Paul, an American woman who spends some time in England and watches the Pankhursts over there, who are very much, let's push the envelope, aggressive, militant even. And then she comes back home thinking, this is the way forward. But the elder stateswomen of the movement are really troubled and scared of Alice and her proposed tactics. And that's an ongoing debate that they have. And I thought it was so fascinating to see this, fast forward 7 decades, similar discussions on what's the best way to go about, well, first of all, what are the goals? And then how to go about them. How did the differing women in early Exponent 2 history, what were some of the challenges they faced on differing approaches?
So they all came to feminism from different viewpoints and perspectives, right? So you have people like Claudia Bushman, who by the time they're publishing, she is a PhD student who is also a mother of 6 children. And then, is wife of the state president. You have other people with any varying number of children. A small number of these women who are working. You have Judy Dushku, who, when they start consciousness raising meetings in 1970, she is single. So she comes out to Boston for grad school and then becomes a professor at Suffolk University, which is just a couple blocks away from Boston Commons. And she is taking her students after class down to the Commons to listen to all of these different debates and protests and all these different activists, just to hear the different arguments and get exposed to lots of different ideas. And she's bringing these ideas back to this group to talk about them. And these women do not agree with each other on a lot of issues. they wrestle, they fight. Claudia talks about how these early meetings that they had were miserable and just like draining because of how much they would just argue. And so they used these group projects as a way to channel that energy and to discuss and stay in community with one another rather than let these differences be the thing that drives them apart. So what we kind of came to is that Exponent initially says, it's being published on the dual platforms of Mormonism and feminism. But as we're going throughout, pretty quickly, we realize that dual platforms often become dueling identities. And it takes shape in lots of different ways. So when issues come up, so when they start publishing, an issue, the first issue they have, like, what does the ER mean? What will the ERA mean to you? And it's this very mild discussion of what the Equal Rights Amendment is and what are some of the pros and cons that people are talking about. But the church, the first presidency, has not come out against the Equal Rights Amendment yet. And that doesn't happen until 76. And that just wildly changed the discussion. When the church goes full in on the Stop ERA movement and is doing things like when International Women's Year, all of the states were supposed to hold these conferences leading up to the National International Women's Year Convention, evaluate how states are doing on gender equality. There's all these platforms. The church in Utah directs every ward to send at least 10 women, and they flood the conference that was expected to have like 2,000 to 3,000. There's like 14,000 women, and the majority of them, the vast majority of them, come and vote down every point of proposal, from greater protections for women against issues of rape to world peace. They just vote down the whole thing because there's this fear that the Equal Rights Amendment is anti-family. And there's lots of there's lots of scare tactics of, does it mean that my daughters are going to be drafted?
The bathrooms. That's when I was a little girl. I can remember my mom talking to me about these scary women like Bella Abzug who are, want me to have to use a bathroom with boys and want to put me, send me to war. But women like Phyllis Schlafly were going to save us. They were going to keep us safe and protect our privileges.
So these women in Boston, where Massachusetts had ratified the ERA in 1972, they are not personally having all of these debates around them. They are hearing it from all over the country and from their friends. And they're watching Mormons for ERA rise up in Virginia, led by Sonia Johnson, and seeing Sonia lead these massive protests, right? Flying a banner over Temple Square during General Conference, going head to head with Senator Hatch on the Congress floor. And it becomes difficult because, yes, these women are probably progressive leaning, and yes, they are feminist, but they're also Mormon women, and they are also connected to the church. And so it is a struggle with, how do we talk about this when we are committed to not actively criticizing general authorities in these early years, and we are committed to balance and showing different perspectives. And so how do we manage this? And there are times that would come up that they would really disagree with how to approach that from an editorial perspective, which led to debates like, who makes the decision? Is it the editor or is it the whole board? And that was another conflict where they had to again and again work that out and smooth that out. But talking about the ERA and writing about that when the church is actively trying to shut it down was a struggle. And we see multiple issues where people are writing in with their perspectives. And then when Sonia is excommunicated at the end of 1979, that becomes a big issue because the women have to grapple with their view of the church in a new way. And Heather, like, how does Judy handle that?
So Judy Dushku, who is just values women, values friendship so much, but she is also she is this political scientist. She is like a social justice warrior. And she absolutely supported Sonia and wanted Sonia to know that she was supported, and wanted her neighbors to see that women like her supported Sonia. And so when Sonia was coming to Boston, she invited her to come to her house, but she did it not as an exponent event, which is what normally would have happened. When somebody kind of prominent that the women wanted to talk to, a historian or some kind of figure would come, they would have an exponent sponsored event. But in this case, Judy was like, that would not sit well. That would imply that these other women were supportive of Sonia, and maybe they were, and maybe they weren't, and maybe they didn't know. Maybe they hadn't decided where they were going to land. So Judy had an event at her house. Everyone was invited who wanted to attend, but it was not labeled with exponent, to make sure. That's how she thread that needle of sort of keeping the peace and supporting the women who were struggling with that, but maintaining true to herself and having her integrity and saying, I am going to show up for this woman, Sonia, and she will know that I have her back.
And so one of those overarching themes that Exponent stands on is community over ideological purity. That when the people are writing it, they don't have to show perfect orthodoxy to the church. There is not a litmus test of how good of a Mormon you are in order to write and publish here. But also there's lots of different feminisms, right? If you, in grad school, you're going to study lots of different camps of feminism. Mormon feminism is not so concerned with checking all the boxes of any very particular ideology of feminism, but is about believing, like, collectively together that there are differences between the sexes under patriarchy within the church, and that it is compatible with the gospel of Jesus Christ to work towards greater equality. Just as kind of a general overarching thing and not any very particular thing. And so community over ideological purity, and that allows them to work on these group projects, to keep talking to each other and to listen and, like, gain reader empathy, while so many of these key issues would easily drive them apart.
And Bryan, I love your point of Alice Paul and, these different approaches, and certainly with the these foundational women of Exponent, you have kind of a range. You've got, Judy, who was more radical, and Carol Sheldon, who was, more willing to push the envelope. And this continues. It seems like we always have this. I'm thinking about the formation of the blog, where a lot of people on the board were like, but we don't get to review the stuff before they put it up. What if we don't like what they say? What if that doesn't represent us? Wait, they're going to use our name? Like, there was a lot of tension between, some of it was generational, but some of it was, ideological.
I love that you're sort of talking about the messiness and activism, because, I think that there's that push and pull within all the movements and the disagreement and the purity, especially when you're reacting to the orthodoxy in Mormonism, the feminist purity that you see, people that take the tools of feminism as an ideology, as a religion, and extract some orthodoxy from it too. That's always a struggle, I think, in these spaces where you do have a lot of women who it's a radical act to even read the blog, right? And so for them to even go that far, there needs to be a place for that. I know we're getting on in time, so I don't want to give any more spoilers, but maybe you could talk about, there's some juicy stuff in here. Like, there's that messiness, that struggle, it's contained in here. Do you just want to give us some teasers maybe of what people could find, some of the juicier stuff that they could buy the book to read about?
I want to hear what Bryan found as his highlights.
Yeah. I so thoroughly enjoyed this. I love 20th century history, and we don't get nearly enough. So much early stuff, so much Joseph Smith, so much of this. Wonderful. There's this other century. It's great. It's wonderful. It's interesting. You highlighted part of the problem, Katie, when you talked about how you have such a difficulty getting sources for 20th century history if you're trying to do anything with institutional stuff. Luckily, you two had this wonderful archive at BYU, which you could get a hold of, and you went through and mined all these fun little details. The meeting minutes. This meeting is, we're struggling because we're zooing it with kids. That one cracked me up. And then you get, the details of the fax machine is in the editor's bedroom for a time, and We're getting submissions from all over the place because people have to get it in on time. And here comes
Poor
a lot.
Jenny Atkinson.
Mhm.
These fascinating details about the retreats. And one year they're like, let's go skinny dipping as part of the retreat. Great. All of a sudden we're reading along. Here's a photo of, I think, Jenny again leading belly dancing classes. And so the book is so well written. If I didn't know better, I'd swear you both had degrees in English or something. Really
Turns
well
out.
written, but it has all these fun little details scattered along the way. But it's the perfect balance, because if you do too many details, then it's nothing but details. And so I really appreciated the writing and the sprinkling of the fun in it. So it
And
was a
that's
delight.
something that was really important to me coming to this book, is that the fun and the joy and the community had to be captured. Like, it just was so important to me that that readers understand that, yes, while women are grappling these really hard things and struggling with general authorities and, you know, all of this stuff, they were also just having the time of their lives and were having such a good time, so much laughter, so much community. And and those are the things that sustain women and heal them in a patriarchal system, are these female friendships
Mhm.
that are just irreplaceable.
It makes the volunteer work possible, right? Like, we haven't really talked about the finances of the organization and how Exponent was almost always just scrapped for cash, right? Like, first issue, they talk about, like, we're operating out of our grocery budgets, like, get in on the kitchen floor. And there are, you know, times when they are a little bit more flush with cash, but like, people aren't getting paid, and people are giving intense hours of volunteer work. And what makes that volunteer work possible is those relationships and those moments of fun. And like, yeah, you worked through, you did a difficult issue, and you finally, you know, you got that to the printer, and now let's go do water ballet in the hotel swimming pool.
Yeah.
Just fun.
One last thing that shouldn't need to be said, but sadly does need to be said, is I think one myth that's going to be out there is, well, this is a book for women. And that could not be further from the truth. And there was that, I'm trying to remember when the meeting happens. Is it the Romney period where they have this meeting and they hash out and they present all these concerns they have. And there's this bishop that goes home and says, oh, I didn't realize that these things made women feel bad. It was like the first time that light clicked on. And that's not a great time to realize that. So just to make it clear that this is by definition not a book just for women. This is important modern history, late 20th century history. Fun time to be in. And you too
And
did.
it's influencing, like, Heather, you talked about how the ensign is kind of in a more progressive, I'm putting words in your mouth, but it's gone through progressive phases. You can sometimes the editors, you know, the writers and editors have read the Exponent. I've talked to people who've worked with it. It's informing, it's a broader history because it's informing the culture here and the online spaces. Certainly my time online was informed by the Bloggernacle, was informed by the Exponent. So I don't think that you can escape church history without 50 years of
No,
this.
And I mean, even we were talking about Nylan McBain's book that came out in 2024 or was it 2014? Thank you. 2014, because it's having its 10-year and the ideas that she puts forward in there, and that part of that was spurred by something she had written called, you know, a modest Mormon. Katie's Mormon my brain.
Manifesto.
I'm getting a modest proposal confused with a moderate Mormon feminist manifesto. And you have Jana Remy on the blog writing a radical Mormon feminist manifesto, not too much before it. And I have no clue if Nylan read that, was aware of it, but it's in the zeitgeist, and Exponent does stuff. And then it's interesting. You see that somehow it does seep in, and maybe it's not always directly, but I think people are talking about it, and then it spurs these other things. It really has this sort of subtle influence. Katie, what's the stealth quote
Um,
from Jan Ships?
yeah, you're putting Mormonism stealth alternative. So yeah, she came in 1997 and talked to the Exponent staff as they had this huge transition from editors. And, this is not long after the September 6th excommunications. And what has happened when that happens is across the board, Sunstone, Dialogue, Exponent have huge drops in subscriptions. And Exponent has other aspects as well that are leading their subscriptions to drop. There's lots of different factors, and we kind of tease those out in the book. But it's a huge turning point. And Jan Ships comes out and talks to them about how they are Mormonism stealth alternative, because they are not out there trying to prove all the facts. They are telling stories and personal experience, and you get an entirely different viewpoint of what it is like to be a Mormon woman in 20th century Mormonism through these stories. And of course, Exponent now, 2024, we have expanded this mission, expanded what we're focused on in gender is now women and gender minorities, that expand what it means to be Mormon, expand what it means to be a feminist, and expand what it means to be a woman.
Well, before we let you go, I'm going to throw this out there. You didn't ask for this, but we were talking earlier about funding. You've done this as a labor of love. People don't realize now that when you write a book these days, you basically pay to write the book. It's so expensive. It costs so much time and hours, and the research. Oh my gosh, the research that you've put into this. And so we were talking about, we would love to have an Audible book, an audio version of this. And that costs money. So I'm going to throw it out there. If someone wants that, if someone listening out there has deep pockets, a cool 10 grand could fund a project like the authors paid for their time to record this, because that's about how much time it would take. So if anyone's out there, reach out to y'all and offer the services. Do it in the service of this history and for Mormon women. I think it would make it even more accessible to a lot of people. So I'm just going to put that bug out there in the ether, and hopefully someone gets it. Do you want us, is there anything else you want readers or listeners to know, or one last plug for why people should read this book?
I think, I know this sounds so narcissistic. I am just in love with this book. I just love it. I have one in every room of my house now. So now I'm like, oh, there's my kitchen copy, and here's my bedroom copy. I love it. And I don't feel egotistical, because most of the book are other women's voices. Katie and I are conductors, but there's this whole orchestra. There's so many different experiences and perspectives, and we used to say Exponent, it's like getting a letter from a dear friend, and it is. I feel like this book is having an encounter with all of these women, and it just feels delightful and sacred at the same time.
Yeah, so we had that archive at BYU Special Collections. We also conducted dozens of interviews of participants from over the years, and that was huge, capturing these oral histories. We also read through all 163 issues of the quarterly publication and thousands of blog posts. And, and we tied all that together to create this. We wrote a history of the organization, and then we have 6 units of selected works from the quarterly, initially newspaper, now magazine, and blog. But my hope is that when readers come to it, that they will find interesting things, find those gems, and then find jumping off points for more history. I believe that good history is generative and gives new ideas and new explorations, that I hope that this is not the landing place with what we get with modern Mormon feminist history, that it is, the face that launches 1,000 ships.
Heather, Katie, congrats on the book. It was so well done. I cheated because I finished reading the book literally like 20 minutes before I hung out with you two, and I got to ask you all of my questions and talk about it. Everyone doesn't get that same opportunity, and I'm sorry, but I'm not even going to be polite about it. Go buy the book. It's excellent. I'm not going to say that the only place to buy it is at Benchmark Books. I will say that the best place to buy it is at Benchmark.
We agree. The best place to buy it is Benchmark Books. By all means, please go. And like, we were able to sign some copies at Restore. Hopefully we'll make another trip actually to the store and sign more copies. But the Trusted Evil also sells it as well.
The important part is that the book gets purchased and read and enjoyed. Yes. So seriously,
and there's Kindle version too.
See, there you go. We're not going to say that the only way to have it is a print copy. That is still the best way, but not the only way. I read actually a good chunk of it in electronic form, so I can't be too hypocritical here. Fantastic work. Digging through, I'm so glad you brought up the interviews, because you that's such an important point, is so many of these people are still with us because it is modern history. And so you can get both their memories of what happened, but also the reflections on what it means now. So a wonderful combination of the archive and the living archive. So go buy the book, enjoy it. It is so well done, friends. Congrats.
Thank you.
And thanks again for coming on the podcast to talk about it.
Yeah, we're so happy to be here.
As an offering for my sins, a smoking incense, brother young, a blood atoning for my sinning, brother young. 'Cause I sinned so gravely, brother Brigham, brother young. I have sinned so gravely, brother young, that only you can save me, brother Brigham, brother young.
The song you heard today is called Brother Brigham, Brother Young by artist Corb Lund. Check out his music at corblund.com and consider giving a donation to sunstone.org to support this podcast.